Hi guys, thank you for joining me tonight. So we've got a really good Christmassy horror story for you tonight, written by one of my favourite horror writers, Mark Morris, who's a brilliant British horror author. So let's just crack on. Each time the baby kicked, Jane winced and recalled her mother gleefully telling her that she'd been a 10-pounder and that it ran in the family. It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but she knew Mum had just been trying to reassure her that the baby would be big and healthy. Snow flurried outside, tapping slyly against the window, making the house seem cosy. Radiators breathed out heat. Occasionally one burbled, and Jane hoped they wouldn't break down, like last year, not when it was almost impossible to persuade plumbers to come all the way out here at Christmas. Sometimes she wished their nearest neighbour wasn't over a mile away, but mostly she didn't mind. If they still lived in London, they wouldn't be able to watch the sun setting spectacularly over the distant fields, wouldn't have badgers ambling through their garden at night, wouldn't be spending their lives accompanied by the soothing rush of the river which paralleled the narrow road that twisted for 2 miles before reaching the village of Brackley, where Jerry had his estate agents. The baby kicked hard again, so that Jane, crossing the lounge, had to grip the back of a chair to steady herself. She decided to lie down in her studio, and once the baby had stopped kicking, made her way not to the kitchen where she'd been heading to find something to nibble, but to the staircase, which she ascended slowly, stopping every few steps to gasp for breath. As she sank onto the camp bed, in the cluttered room, which also contained her easel, her boxes of chalk pastels, a dusty bookcase stuffed with reference material, and dozens of stacked frames and half-finished pictures, she wondered whether she would go the full term. Today was the 21st, and the baby was due on the 29th, but she already felt fit to pop. If she had it within the next couple of days, she might still be home for Christmas. However, ideally, she'd prefer to get Christmas out of the way before the endless round of feeding and nappies and sleepless nights began. She was just drifting off when she heard a sound coming from the landing directly outside her door. It sounded like breathing, though it was heavy and liquid, somehow sludgy. Jane imagined the man, she was sure it was a man, pressing his nose against the wood. She lay rigid until the stealthy ticking of snow against the window became a sudden flurry, making her jump. When the flurry subsided, the breathing had gone. Jane lay and listened for 5 minutes longer, but all she could hear was the river rushing along outside. When she told Jerry that evening, he looked concerned, but tried to come up with reasons why she must have been mistaken. If the house was empty and the doors locked, then you must have imagined it. Besides, why would a man break into the house and then leave without doing anything? Perhaps he thought the house was empty and fled when he realised it wasn't, she said, trying to convince herself. Or perhaps we've got a ghost. Don't be silly. I won't have you scaring yourself witless over nothing, not in your condition. I'm not scaring myself, Jerry. I know what I heard. Frowning, he said, I could always drop you off at Katie's before I go to work. No, I won't be forced out of my own house. Don't worry, I keep the mobile close by anyway in case of... you know what. She pointed at her belly. Despite her tiredness, she was too uncomfortable to sleep that night. She shifted with an effort from one position to another, rearranging the cushions she'd been using to support her stomach and ease the ache in her back, but it was no use. In the end, she gave up and gazed for a while into the wavering darkness, listening to Jerry's soft snoring, the river telling him to hush, and the distant cry of an owl. At length, inevitably, the pricking of her bladder prodded her from her cocoon. She shivered as she pushed the duvet aside, the night's chill coaxing goosebumps from her flesh. She pulled on her dressing gown and plodded to the toilet for the umpteenth time that day, then decided that she couldn't face returning to bed. With luck, if she made herself a hot drink downstairs and stretched out on the settee with a book, she might end up dozing off. The lounge was still warm from the embers in the fire, whose glow lapped the walls. She picked up her book from the sideboard, then immediately dropped it with a cry of disgust. The cover was spongy and slimy, as if slugs had been crawling across it all night. As if touching the bloated paperback had prompted it, a smell suddenly touched Jane's nostrils. It was damp, rotten, salty smell like decaying seaweed. She turned her head towards the kitchen door from behind which the smell seemed to be emanating, and heard a bumping, slithering sound, as if something large and soft and uncoordinated was moving about. Though her instinct was to sink down into the shadows between the sideboard and the broken grandfather clock that Jerry was always tinkering with, she told herself firmly that she mustn't give in to her fear. She marched boldly across the hall, the tiles like ice beneath her bare feet, and pushing open the kitchen door to reveal a block of fetid and somehow bulging darkness, reached in and slapped the light switch. Did something clammy, something disconcertingly like slug flesh, briefly caress the back of her hand before the room was filled with light? Apparently not, for the kitchen was empty. No, not quite empty. The dank smell was still there, though fading now, and there were patches of wet leading across the lino to the back door. Jane licked her lips, then also paced across the lino, taking care not to step in the puddles. She inspected the door. It was locked and bolted from the inside. Suddenly she felt queasy and faint. She needed to sit down. She hurried out of the kitchen, leaving the light on, and back into the lounge. She sank onto the settee, curled her hands protectively around her belly, and stared into the crumbling embers of the fire. The next thing she knew, it was morning. The fire was nothing but grey ash, and her feet were numb with cold. She tried to massage some life into them, then padded back across the hallway to the kitchen. The wet patches on the lino had dried, leaving no indication that they'd ever been there. Katie, Jane's elder sister, picked her up at noon that day and took her for lunch at the Leaping Hare, a pub 5 miles and 2 villages away that was on Egon Ronay's recommended list. Jane had not told Jerry about her experiences in the early hours because he'd woken up irritable, as if he was the one who'd had a night of broken sleep. Neither, she decided, would she tell Katie. For daylight had diminished the power of the experience, and she knew that relating it in the Christmas cheer of a country pub would only make her sound silly. Nevertheless, the experience preyed on her mind enough for Katie to comment on how quiet she was. I'm not getting much sleep, Jane said, and placed her hand on her stomach. Soon be over, said Katie, who had 2 school-age boys of her own. The food in the pub was better than good. The leaping flames in the grate at the far end of the room reminded Jane of muscles that the bellowing fire kept flexing. Once, she thought the tree guarding the cigarette machine had grown hot enough to burn, but the flames she saw dancing in its branches were only reflections in the baubles that the tree wore. Barmaids sported silver tinsel scarves, and Noddy Holder yelled, "It's Christmas!" from the jukebox, all of which helped Jane relax. Nevertheless, she was frowning as she wafted a thread of cigarette smoke, thinking of the baby, when the landlord shouted, "Phone call for Mrs. Granger." As Jane reached the bar, the landlord said cheerily, "Sounds like your man's got flu." And he handed her the receiver. "Hello," said Jane, pressing a hand to her exposed ear to block out shaking Stevens. She thought the connection had been broken until she realised it was not static she was listening to, but sludgy, tortured breathing. "Who is this?" she demanded sharply enough to earn several curious glances. Did the breathing possess a voice that was attempting to form words? Caw. It seemed to be gurgling. Jane put the phone down. Though she was shaking, the pub suddenly seemed too stuffy. She stumbled back to her seat and plumped down, her breath coming in short gasps. "Are you all right?" asked Katie, alarmed. "You look terrible." Jane blurted out everything. She didn't care any more how silly Katie might think her. Her sister listened with pursed lips, then paid the bill and took her home. Later, Jane was following a trail of dying fish up the stairs, their twitching silver bodies gleaming like Christmas decorations. Did the slow, squelching footsteps she could hear belong to her, or to whoever had left the trail for her to follow? She inched open the bathroom door and caught a glimpse of the bloodless, slimy flesh of the figure in the bath as it turned its dripping ruin of a face towards her. She woke with a cry, Katie sitting beside her. The late afternoon darkness outside the window was hard and cold like black ice. The next day was Saturday. As Jerry went to the supermarket and to pick up the tree they'd ordered, Jane stayed by the fire. She turned the radio up loud enough for the carol singers' voices to become distorted on the high notes. The sound she could hear in the pauses between hymns was not sludgy breathing, but the gurgling of the river across the road from the house. When the phone rang, she almost left it, but eventually snatched it up and aggressively said, "Yes?" It was Katie, who seemed not to notice her tone, ringing to ask what time she should invade with her clan on Christmas Day. Soon afterwards, Jerry arrived home, full of Christmas cheer and laden with goodies. They sipped wine as they dressed the tree, then settled down to watch It's a Wonderful Life as snow swirled around the house like a swarm of white flies looking for a way in. Jerry rested a hand on her stomach as the baby squirmed. He smiled soporifically. "There'll be 3 of us next Christmas." She kissed him on the nose. "There's still time for there to be 3 of us this Christmas." Though she'd only drunk 2 glasses, the wine helped her fall asleep quickly that night. But in the early hours, she jolted awake as if someone had shaken her. Immediately she heard the sound of something rustling stealthily by the window. She looked in that direction and saw a figure with a pale round head and rudimentary features. She sat up so suddenly that she wrenched her stomach, waking the baby, though even as the pain made her gasp, she realised what she'd really seen and heard. The glow of the moon through the curtains, the sound of snow settling on the window. She was snuggling down again when she heard the screech of tyres from outside, followed by a thunderous splash. Instinct made her want to leap out of bed, though her aching stomach forced her to perform the manoeuvre with care. She hurried to the window and yanked back the curtains. Could she see car headlights sinking beneath the river, or was it merely an odd reflection of the moon? Certainly there appeared to be something large and black just beneath the river's surface. Jerry. Jerry. Try as she might, Jane couldn't wake him. He'd always been a heavy sleeper, and he'd drunk far more wine than she had. Dragging on a dressing gown and a pair of trainers, she hurried downstairs and out of the house. It was bitterly cold. though the snow's kisses were gentle on her face. The river, its banks crusted with ice, flashed as if filled with churning chunks of metal. Taking care not to slip, Jane craned forward to peer into the water, but could see nothing. Turning back towards the house, she saw a figure standing by the front door that she'd left ajar. It was only a momentary glimpse before a swirl of snow broke it up and carried it away, but she was left with the impression of bloated white flesh and dark clothes slick with water or slime. A pulse jumped in her throat as she stalked back to the house, her nervousness making her angry. Inside, she went straight to the phone and called the police, who arrived 20 minutes later and spent almost an hour searching the river, to no avail. Are you sure you'd be alright if I pop out for a couple of hours? Jerry asked her the next day. It was Christmas Eve, and his friend Graham, who he played five-a-side with, had invited him for a pint with the lads. I'll be fine, said Jane, secretly relishing the chance to be on her own for a while. Jerry had been bemused to find the police on his doorstep at 3 a.m, and he'd spent the day treating her with a kind of amused indulgence. When he said something about pregnant women's hormones doing funny things to their minds, she had to stop herself from thumping him. She was angry when he wasn't back by 9, but didn't really start worrying until after 11. By midnight, her anxiety was a hard lump at the base of her throat. She phoned Katie, who was up late wrapping the boys' presents, and who came over immediately. Jane had just decided to call the police when they arrived with a swish of tyres on the snowy drive. Katie held her as the power of her dread seemed to make them say the words she'd been expecting to hear. Coming back from the pub, Jerry had lost control of the car, which had plunged into the river. The accident had happened several hours ago, but it had taken a while for police divers to recover his body from the submerged vehicle. After the police had gone, Jane sat and stared into space as Katie wept and clung to her. Jane felt numb, unable to produce tears. The Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, like a joke in appallingly bad taste. The baby that Jerry had been so looking forward to, but which he would now never see, moved inside her. But Jane felt distance from it and its imminent birth. Later, in a flat voice, she said, "You tried to warn me." Katie, bleary with tears and exhaustion, said, "What?" "Everything that's happened. Don't you see? It was Jerry coming back. Why didn't I listen to what he was trying to say?" Katie looked at her for a moment and then said softly, "Jane, you don't know what you're saying. How can someone come back to you before they're even..." She choked on the last word. Jane's face was expressionless, her voice eerily calm. He wanted this baby so much. So he found some way. Then suddenly, shockingly, her face twisted and she was wailing, almost screaming, the grief pouring out of her. It was 5 o'clock on Christmas morning when the knock came on the front door. Katie was asleep in the armchair, so exhausted that she didn't even stir. Jane was still awake, quiet again now. Shattered, though unable to sleep, staring into the fire. She padded into the hallway, and pulled the door open. When she saw what was standing outside, she remembered the phone call in the pub and all at once realised what the caller had been trying to say. Jerry had wanted her to know that nothing in this world or beyond would prevent him coming home for Christmas. Oh, Jerry. So, next Sunday story, it'll be after Christmas, won't it? It'll be on the 27th. So, have a wonderful Christmas, everybody. I think for a lot of us it's going to be a fairly low-key Christmas this year. I shall be rattling around on my own up at Redbeard Towers, eating an enormous curry and watching the most ridiculous horror films you can imagine. So whatever you're doing on Christmas Day, I hope it's something you enjoy. And I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, guys, and happy Christmas.